Those on the left are notorious for critiquing their own movements, and we have seen a lot of criticisms of the left, some of them valid and others overblown. But there is one big problem with the left that I almost never see any discussion about. It is a problem that has arguably plagued the left since the very beginning, and makes up the biggest weakness in their strategy, especially now. People on the left are often quick to assume that their ideas will become popular just because they are beneficial to the objective economic conditions of the majority of the population. And they consequently rely solely on rational appeals and fact-based arguments to win over support. Such an approach is ineffectual, and it fails to adapt to the conditions of today's postmodern society, and we feel that this is one of the biggest weaknesses with a strictly economic materialist analysis that does not consider the social and psychological conditions of the human subject. Don't get the wrong idea, I find Marxism and historical materialism really useful for analyzing the actual material conditions of history and how political events unfold, which we demonstrate in the Why Billionaires Vote Democrat video. However, while orthodox Marxism is useful for interpreting the actual world, I believe that it has many limitations when trying to interpret how people interpret the world. This is because such an approach does not always consider the social climate of society and the psychological aspects of how people gravitate to social movements. In this video, we'll demonstrate why the left needs a libidinal and spiritual appeal in order to build a mass movement. By spiritual appeal, we do not mean the new age narcissistic self-improvement bullshit, which really just appropriates spiritual aesthetics and ideas to sell consumer products, which is really just late capitalist hustle culture rebranded. Spirituality, and not necessarily in the religious sense, should not be an individualistic pursuit to triumph above competition, but rather a collective desire for mutual harmony and higher consciousness that transcends the banality of everyday life under capitalism. Spirituality and religion has always existed in some way, shape, or form, and it will continue to exist. People can either try to abolish it like the Soviets tried, or replace it with an esoteric occultism like the fascists in Germany did, or they can embrace the positive aspects of the potentials that spirituality can provide. If the left wants to win, it can't do so solely by appealing to material conditions alone, even though that is very important. There needs to be various forms of spreading emancipatory ideas in an accessible and captivating way. We started to discuss this issue in the last video, which featured Zero Book's author and Professor Mike Watson, where we drew on some of the ideas from his book Can the Left Learn to Meme, which emphasizes the importance of abstract art, alternative media, and meme making in the spreading of leftist ideas and class consciousness. This video will also draw upon some of the ideas from Mike Watson's work, as well as the late Mark Fisher and his concept of acid communism, which analyzes the pros and cons of the hippie movement and what the left can learn from it. Before exploring what exactly the vision of acid communism would entail, we need to address the social conditions of the present society which the left is struggling to adapt to. As said in the last video, the so-called marketplace of ideas is not a meritocracy, it is a market. In the same way that effective marketing is sometimes more important than the product itself, whether an ideological content being sold is based on facts or actually benefits the material conditions of a political consumer are not the only factors which make them adopt that ideology or political position. Political factions of all sides like to lay claim to truth, and the truths or narratives that dominate are not necessarily the ones that are the most true. Jordan Peterson is arguably the most famous academic on the planet, and that tells you everything. Now, this does not mean that no facts exist, and that they are not important in getting people to be aware of the world around them and their history. Facts definitely matter, and unlike the right, the left does not have to be deceitful and make up flat-out lies in order to make their ideas sound appealing. However, the ways in which messages are delivered, framed, and the aesthetics that they are presented with are arguably more and more important in this day and age. In the last video, which was a prequel to this one, we went over some of the ideas in Watson's book, such as the political potential of memes and how they could arguably be considered a form of artistic production that can help the spread of leftist ideas. Memes, along with abstract art, video making, podcasts, and conscious music, are just some of the many ways in which we can spread leftist ideas and class consciousness. Now, first of all, making memes, videos, articles, and other forms of online persuasive or artistic content is in no way a replacement for direct action. However, we live in a digital world, and I have a bit of a problem with the old school mentality of just go organize and do direct action in the real world through strikes and unions. I see this attitude especially with old school socialists, and for those who think that everything can be solved through direct action, or better yet, a magical revolution, I ask, you in what army? No strike, protest, or political revolution is even remotely possible if people aren't even left enough to support a candidate like Bernie Sanders. Simply put, no leftist project will work, no matter how tame or radical it is, if not enough people are leftists. Even if all of the factions of the socialist left in America united today, it would still make up less than the population of New York City. The main war that is to be won first is in the realm of ideology, which most people don't even know they're in. Going on strikes, protests, or other forms of direct action are good and all, but they won't do anything if you are still a fringe minority in the realm of political discourse. There is clearly a long way to go, and leftists need to face the reality that there needs to be new ways to introduce people to leftist thought. At the end of the day, without challenging capitalist ideology, you cannot challenge capitalism. And the internet is one of the most important arenas in which you can do so. But just trying to get people to read theory, or even read Jacobin articles for that matter, will not be enough, and expecting working class people to rationally revolt based on their objective economic conditions won't work either. And if it did work, a revolution, or at least the election of a democratically elected socialist, would have happened a long time ago. The main point of this video, which is a simple one but one that often is overlooked by the practices of the modern left, is that a movement which is solely predicated on rationalism will never become a mass movement. A mass movement needs a libidinal psychological appeal. Most people probably intuitively know this, but the left never seems to actually put these ideas into practice. If orthodox Marxists failed to capitalize on the hippie movement in the United States and the student movements of the May 68 protests in France, then repeating the same reductive materialist strategy definitely won't work right now. This is not 1917 Russia. People forget that during May 1968, the student protests were so large that there arguably could have been a revolution. The French president Charles de Gaulle actually fled the country in retreat. While the students of the counterculture protests in France were certainly more socialist than the American hippies were, as socialism had much wider support in France than it did in America, where everyone was being fed Cold War propaganda and not even taught any of the ideas of socialism, the communist parties of France still believed the students of their time to be bourgeois and did not take the uprisings as seriously as they could have. In both France and America, there was a generational disconnect with the students of the counterculture and older generation socialists, many of which, especially amongst the communist parties, took an orthodox view of Marxism that believed the revolution should be carried out solely by the working class alone. As we see today, leftists struggling to adapt to the modern social conditions is still a problem. While different socialists may have particular ways in which they want a political project to unfold, radical political movements come and go very fast in very spontaneous, unpredictable times. So it is wiser to try to work with what is already there than just dismissing everything abruptly. Socialist ideas are not as pervasive as they could be yet, and the cons of various social movements should be analyzed with scrutiny, and the pros of them should be considered and harnessed. In a posthumous essay titled Acid Communism, Mark Fisher wrote about how the hippie movement, despite all its annoying flaws and the fact that it was later co-opted by the spectacle of neoliberal capitalism, had promising potential in that it was an emancipatory social movement that had ideologically popularized alternative principles that ran counter to the capitalist lifestyle and mode of production. Even if it was not successful on a political level, it had potential to be a social revolution. And political attitudes need to change before any political system change is possible. While many Marxists are quick to dismiss the hippie movement as bourgeois decadence, and many blame the movement as a whole for the fall of the left, Fisher actually argues that it was really the Marxist parties who failed to adapt to their climate and tap into the emancipatory potentials that the hippie counterculture movement was beginning to exhibit. The counterculture movement was ripe with open-minded people who wanted something different to capitalism, even if that wasn't Soviet communism. Here's Mark Fisher arguing against the claim that if the counterculture led to neoliberalism, then better that the counterculture had not happened. Quote, "In fact, the opposite argument is more convincing, that the failure of the left after the 60s had much to do with its repudiation of, or refusal to engage with, the dreamings that the counterculture unleashed. The most common criticism of 60s and 70s counterculture was that it was not entirely led by the working class, even though there were many working class people who were a part of it. It was primarily the middle class. However, this does not necessarily mean that the movement did not have any potential or that it was just bourgeois decadence. As Mark Fisher eloquently puts it, quote, "Where the new culture was not being driven by those from working class backgrounds, it seemed that it was being led by class regardless, by young people from bourgeois families who had rejected their own class destinies and identified downwards, or rather outwards. They wanted to do anything but go into business and banking." This sentiment was most iconically manifested with bands like Pink Floyd, who did come from bourgeois families, but rejected the class destinies that their parents set upon them, and instead wanted to do a mass appeal and a rejection of capitalism. Those who are familiar with the themes in Pink Floyd's music are well aware of their critiques of capitalism. Plus, it is also important to recognize that we no longer live in an age where the distinctions between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are so clear. The working class is no longer just comprised of factory workers and farmers anymore. And are small-time owners of corner stores, McDonald's managers, and small coffee shop owners part of the capitalist class? Well, technically yes, because they do own capital, but this hardly makes them bourgeois. Before debating on how a socialist society ought to be achieved, it is important to outline what a socialist movement would be based on, rather than just what it's seeking to remove. Of course, a social movement without any concrete political goals, like the hippie movement, is doomed to fail. But a hardline socialist movement without any libidinal, spiritual, or psychological appeal that fails to adapt to today's social conditions cannot succeed either. We should learn from the positive potentials of both movements, as well as their weaknesses. And let's be clear, there were certainly a lot of problems with the hippie counterculture movement. For one, it was debatably not even a political movement at all, in the sense that there wasn't really a coherent political ideology guiding it. Even though the movement espoused leftist values, there wasn't really a coherent political ideology that would actually guide people as to how to overcome the capitalist system. While it is important to acknowledge that Marxist parties failed to tap into this social movement, in defense of the Marxists, this was a very hard task to do, particularly in the United States, where popularity for socialism was not very high due to all the Red Scare propaganda, as well as all the baggage associated with socialism due to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But arguably the biggest problem with the new counterculture movement is that many of the hippies, particularly the upper middle class bourgeois faction of the hippies, gravitated to neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s. Though I do not consider this to be an indictment of the values of the hippie counterculture movement, but rather because neoliberalism simply filled the void before any other political movement was able to. It is important to acknowledge that at the time there was very minimal political alternatives to choose from, and the globalist appeal of neoliberalism seemed rather progressive for its time. Its loose ideas of freedom, consumer choice, and the end of bureaucracy seemed very appealing at the time. And of course, the people being sold this ideology had no way of knowing what neoliberalism would amount to, and as a result, many hippies, more particularly the upper middle class bourgeois faction, became Silicon Valley capitalists or voters of Bill Clinton. However, this disappointing outcome should not be an indictment of the values that the hippie movement espoused, most of which align much more with socialism than they do with capitalism. Just because a movement or an idea becomes commodified does not mean that that movement or idea has no value. In this stage of neoliberal capitalism, almost nothing is immune to the co-option of capital. Nowadays, we increasingly see the commodification of spirituality in the self-help wellness industry. We also see the commodification of many socio-political movements, such as feminism, LGBTQ, and Black Lives Matter. However, just because they have been co-opted by neoliberal capitalism does not make all the ideas in these movements invaluable. Rather than rejecting these movements and ideas altogether, the left should reframe the narrative and advocate for a political solution that is alternative to capitalism, that actually brings solutions to the things that these groups are advocating for. Whether or not socialists want to tap into these movements, neoliberal capitalism will find a way to capitalize on it regardless. So what should socialists do? Leave all these social movements open to the co-option of neoliberal capitalism? Or should they adapt to the game that they're in and try to win? There was obviously something special that gravitated so many people to the counterculture movement. And maybe the left should learn from these things, and learn from the mistakes that these movements fell into. A socialist movement must have a social component as well as a material one. Mark Fisher envisioned such a leftist movement, which he called Acid Communism. A bit of a goofy term, but he had his reasons for the choice of words. Acid Communism was meant to strengthen the political imagination. But why go back to the 60s? Why not embrace a brand new future? Or embrace a futuristic solar punk aesthetic, perhaps? To understand what Fisher was getting at with acid communism, we have to quickly understand two of Fisher's prior concepts, capitalist realism and hauntology. Capitalist realism is the pervasive atmosphere and stubborn mind prison that there is no alternative to capitalism. To make things worse, according to Mark Fisher at least, the future has been cancelled. Which brings us to hauntology, the social condition whereby people are incapable of imagining new futures, and where instead memories or aspects of older cultural trends reappear as ghosts in various parts of our culture. Fisher's work on cyberpunk is a testament to this. The embedded assumption in cyberpunk films and video games is that capitalism will continue and eventually destroy humanity, which is emblematic of society's nihilism and inability to imagine a future that escapes capitalism. According to Fisher, the left has been stuck between two outdated modes of thinking, one being post-war social democracy and unionism, a defeatist ideology of compromise, and the second being what he calls the Leninist superego, the revolutionary tendency of zero compromise seen in a lot of Marxist-Leninist and Maoist movements. You could also throw anarchism in there as well, even though it is highly different. While there is certainly still legitimacy to the ideas espoused by these older political tendencies, the fact that leftists are still basing their entire politics off of older revolutionary political figures and their iconography is itself a symptom of hauntology, the inability to imagine a completely new leftist vision, and instead resurrect old revolutionary ghosts from the dead, perhaps out of desperation, nostalgia, or even political fandom. But just because the left should rethink their optics doesn't mean that they should compromise their demands. Optics and rhetorical strategy should be considered independently from actual political policy. Now, while I'm a little bit skeptical of some of Fisher's assumptions, what he argues is that since people ostensibly cannot imagine new futures, we might as well resurrect promising lost futures that actually had potential, but were never actualized, such as the 60s psychedelic counterculture movements, which had some interesting emancipatory potentials, but never actually had a concrete political orientation or focus. In Fisher's view, contemporary leftism has developed the negative reputation of a moralistic school that demands people to sacrifice individual pleasure for the greater collective good. When on the contrary, socialism should be seen as a favorable alternative to capitalist realism that is in fact necessary to truly liberate the individual from the drudgery of long work hours, precarity, austerity, and mental alienation. The left should be about common wealth, collective ownership over work, optimal happiness, and most importantly, free time. Another key component of acid communism and Mark Fisher's work as a whole was mental health. He argued that one of the most corrosive aspects of late capitalism is how it privatizes all our problems, diagnoses individual causes, and prescribes individual solutions, like drugs with dubious side effects. Mark Fisher argued that mental health should be treated as a political issue, as the alienation, stress, and economic demands brought upon by late capitalism must either cause or at the very least exacerbate many mental health problems, such as depression, anxiety, and ADHD. For Fisher, the broad notion of acid communism was a way to politicize mental health, as a socialist society of some sort would be the only way to provide us with the free time, workplace democracy, and the basic necessities of life like housing, food, education, and healthcare to allow us to deal with the mental health problems more seriously. But in order to create such a society and break out of capitalism, we need a dose of imagination. This is where acid communism comes in. For Fisher, acid is the symbolic creative component of acid communism that is aimed at raising the consciousness necessary to break out of old habits of thinking and to envision a new future. This could be interpreted literally as well. Psychoactive drugs like LSD and psilocybin mushrooms are one of the ways to open up the mind and deconstruct the socially constructed filters of our reality. In the 1960s, there was an increased public and intellectual interest in the psychiatric and spiritual use of psychedelic drugs. But by the 70s, the criminalization of all psychedelic drugs under Richard Nixon had brought research to an effective halt. Now, because Mark Fisher only left us with one unfinished essay on acid communism, there is a lot of work to do, and there's many ways we can interpret the idea of acid communism and fill in its gaps. For my interpretation, I believe that we should consider the idea of acid in acid communism a little more seriously. In many cases, psychedelics can lead to ego dissolution, or at the very least, an ego check, which can also serve as a reality check. In multiple studies, subjects who have taken psychedelic substances have reported having humbling experiences that open their mind and have given them an increased sense of self-awareness. Perhaps these things could be useful for combating ideology as well as sectarian dogmatism, which has historically weakened the left and is still a major problem today. In both a metaphorical and literal sense, what psychedelic culture can mean for the left is an increased sense of interconnectedness and an open-mindedness to engage in dialogue and forego absolute political identities and factionalism. No more meaningless fights between Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, Trotskyists, and anarchists. While there are certainly many political disagreements that are real and important, I would argue that the reason for most sectarianism on the left is often based in an egoic attachment to political identity. When we are unable to separate politics from political identity, any rational criticisms of a person's political ideology become perceived as personal attacks on the individual. This should not be the case. And of course, this is not exclusive to Marxist-Leninists or Maoists. It is all over the political spectrum. At the end of the day, with how small the left is, it is absolutely meaningless to have so much sectarian infighting over events that are long in the past. And of course, literally taking shrooms and LSD will not necessarily solve this problem, but perhaps it can make people more open-minded and learn to separate politics from personal identity. At the very least, on a symbolic level, these are attitudes that should be embraced by the left, who is supposed to embrace difference and not be hostile to it. But as we see nowadays, not just spirituality, but even psychedelics have begun to be co-opted again by a contemporary late capitalism. We are starting to see the commodification of psychedelics in Silicon Valley, with microdosing being touted as a way to improve productivity, a narrative promoted by the likes of capitalists like Kevin O'Leary. But rather than letting capitalism co-opt everything, Mark Fisher argues that the left should politicize mental health and reclaim spiritual psychedelic culture and blend it with the communist politics that it was previously lacking. One of the few popular leftist personalities who seemed to embody the characteristics of this kind of social movement was the late Michael Brooks, who heavily emphasized how the left should be more tolerant to religion and spiritual practices. And Brooks, along with other intellectuals like Cornel West, emphasized a thing called Machiavellian Spirituality: to be kind with people, but ruthless with systems.